Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. Okay, let's look at the book of Leviticus. You may remember that when we looked at the previous book, the book of Exodus, I mentioned that that book ends with a big problem, a big question mark over the final climactic chapter, Exodus 40. The Israelites have just built the tabernacle, the Lord's presence manifested in the cloud and the fire has just moved in, so to speak, and everyone is celebrating because the Lord's presence is right here, and then Moses suddenly realizes to his horror that he's unable to go in precisely because the Lord's presence is there. And so the question with which the book of Exodus ends is, how can we go into the presence of the Lord? To put it another way, how can we, an unclean and unholy people, draw near to a holy God? How can the holy God remain in the presence of his people? And the book of Leviticus answers that question. Actually, it's quite striking the way it does so in the narrative. The very first phrase of the book of Leviticus, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. You can just imagine, it's almost like a sort of semi-dramatic moment. Moses and his mates are sitting around, scratching their heads, having a cup of coffee, wondering what to do to get in there. And then the Lord calls them and says, Moses, come over here. And the book of Leviticus begins just like that. And what follows, of course, is 7 chapters of the solution, which is sacrifice. The book of Leviticus describes how the people of God can remain close to and draw near in worship to a holy God when they themselves are polluted and unholy because of their sinfulness. And sacrifice is the answer. So Leviticus starts with 7 chapters of discussions and explanations about different kinds of sacrifices. You've then got chapter 8 all about the ordination of the priests, and chapter 9 is the service of the priests offer to the Lord. And then the book continues with all kinds of other regulations for holiness and purity and cleanliness, touching on many, many different aspects of life. And what you start to realize is, holiness really does touch every aspect of life. Everything you do in normal life, things that you touch, normal biological processes, normal things that go wrong with houses like mold in the walls and so on. All of these have implications for our holiness, or rather our lack of it. It's as though what the book of Leviticus is saying is just the condition of being human in a fallen world is enough to make us unholy, to make us need sacrifice to purify and cleanse us so we can draw close to the living God. And of course that's true. Just the condition of being human in a fallen world is the condition of being unholy before a holy God. Our sin is so all-pervasive that we can't deal with it in some kind of superficial way. We need the purification that comes from the sacrificial blood that is offered in the book of Leviticus here in order to remain close to God. And of course that raises all kinds of questions about the function and the efficacy of those sacrifices. I'll say something about that in a moment. But before we get there, we need to observe one more point about the structure of the book of Leviticus. Right at the heart of the book, in chapter 16, is, if you like, the most important day of sacrificial worship in the whole of the Israelite calendar, the great Day of Atonement, when all of the sins of all of the people are, figuratively, so to speak, carried away out of the camp on the head of the scapegoat after the other goat has been killed. It's a very significant chapter, and it lies at the heart of the book of Leviticus, at the heart of Israel's life as a nation. In fact, it's the case that in some ancient Jewish traditions, and I think perhaps even in some more recent Jewish traditions, the book of Leviticus was the first book that was ever taught to young Jewish children because of its rightly perceived importance for their life as a community. Now, I said I'd say something about sacrifices and holiness and so on, and how we're supposed to think about these things and the efficacy of sacrifices in particular. Because on the one hand, you want to say that these sacrifices were absolutely essential to Israel's life as a nation. Without them, they could not enter the presence of the living God or they couldn't worship him, and their priests couldn't enter his presence in the tabernacle. And yet, on the other hand, you want to say with the book of Hebrews that the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sins. Only the sacrifice of Christ, which these sacrifices prefigure, takes away sins. So what's going on there? How are we supposed to think of these sacrifices? And there are various illustrations and analogies which you may find helpful. One I found particularly noteworthy. I think this is Michael Morales in one of his books on Exodus. He's well worth looking out for. He says Old Testament sacrifices are a little bit like writing a check to be cashed from a bank account where the deposit hasn't been made yet. So you write a check for $1,000 or something, but there's only $5 in the bank account. And the question is, well, if you try and cash this check now, you're going to be in trouble. It's going to bounce. But the check is still valuable because the day will come when the deposit is made, which is sufficient to cover the cost of this check. That deposit, of course, is the sacrifice of Christ. When Christ has been sacrificed, suddenly that account will have all the money you need in it, and it will be enough to cash every check you might write to, so to speak, pay down your sin. I don't know whether you like that illustration. If it helps you, wonderful. If it doesn't help you, my apologies, and you can leave it. But it's a helpful way, I think, of understanding why they were so significant, these sacrifices. You've got to write a check to give to somebody, and yet at the same time, we've not yet reached the moment in history when the efficacy of the sacrificial system as a whole has been revealed and finally accomplished. Just a word or two about holiness. A lot of the regulations in Leviticus look somewhat arbitrary. Things about skin diseases and menstruation and mould in the walls of houses and mildew in garments and so on and so forth. One way of trying to make some sense of these is to think about them in relation to the doctrine of creation, and particularly in relation to the proper distinctions and separations and integrity of things in creation. So just to take one example, there are boundaries between things that are established in the created world, where things are separated from each other. And you find echoes of that in the Leviticus legislation, separating fabrics so that you don't mix them in the same garment, separating animals so that you don't interbreed them, separating crops so that you don't grow them in the same field. Even in the regulations about skin diseases and so on, you can think of what's happening with the skin diseases, that the boundary of your skin is being broken, and therefore that brings with it a certain kind of unholiness, because what's inside starts to come out. That's probably in the background of some of those holiness regulations. One final thought on one particular chapter. Take a look at chapter 9. This is the first fully narrated worship service in the Bible, at least with all the different elements in place. And it's quite striking to observe the resemblance it bears to our service of worship. It begins with a call for worship, and then there are a series of sacrifices. There's a sin offering, and then there is a burnt offering, probably better translated an ascension offering, but it's called a burnt offering because the whole animal was burnt and therefore ascended in the smoke to the Lord. So sin offering, burnt offering or ascension offering for the priest, then that's repeated for the people, sin offering, burnt offering or ascension offering. And then you've got a sacrifice of peace offerings, which is the one where all the people would eat of it, before the final blessing and commissioning benediction at the end. And it's just kind of interesting. Even at a superficial glance, you can see the correspondence between that and different elements of our worship, beginning with a call to worship, ending with a benediction. There's a meal towards the end, just as in our worship. There's a section which is specifically devoted to dealing with the confession of sin, the sin offering towards the beginning, and so on. And it turns out that on closer scrutiny, the superficial similarity actually bears up, and there's a great deal of structural similarity between this worship service and our modern worship service. But that's something else to think about, perhaps in more detail another day. I hope that's intriguing enough for now for you to want to get into the book of Leviticus for yourself. For now, though, the Lord bless you, and bye for now.